Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is the president of Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer. Ian, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Brittany.
You recently gave your 2025 State of the World speech, and in the speech, you talk about where the United States is going, both domestically and on the global stage. Some of what you said was pretty startling. You said at some points that history has never seen where we are. We're in an unprecedented moment. I want to start where we are, though, right now, 10 months into President Trump's second term. What sticks out to you the most?
The United States has become, by far, the biggest driver of geopolitical uncertainty and instability around the world. And as someone who has looked at global risk and opportunity for my entire career, that's unprecedented. When I started Eurasia Group back in 1998, you wouldn't have even needed a US analyst because, you want to do business in America, you don't need to pay attention to the politics. Just, is it a good business idea? What are the markets telling you? Today, the United States is deciding that it wants to change the nature of its leadership. It's much more transactional, it's much more unilateralist, and it's led by a president that has marshaled and consolidated an extraordinary amount of power. We've certainly seen nothing like this since the days of FDR. You can't, even Nixon, there was nowhere close to the same level of executive imperial presidency that you have right now. And so that is the principal change. And so then the question is, what is it changing to? What's driving it? And then what are the implications and how do others respond to it?
And I want to get to all of that. I do want to quote you because this is what stuck out to me and it's perfectly fitting into this theme. This is what you said during your speech. The United States, still today the world's most powerful nation, has chosen to walk away from the international system that the United States built and led for 3/4 of a century. Not because it's weak, not because it has to, because it wants to. So I think
it's a
from
choice.
there,
it is an active choice. That's right.
So why are we choosing that? I mean, how did we get here?
Well, it's funny. In the last 20 years, if you would have a big conversation about these major, global order questions, the presumption, which turned out to be completely wrong, is that, well, China's rising, the United States is going to decline, the US is going to be unhappy with that, the Chinese are going to want to change things, and that probably leads to conflict, maybe war, and that's what we need to avoid. China has been rising, but the United States has not been declining. In fact, America's allies have been declining in their defense capabilities. They've not been spending on it. And their technological capabilities, they haven't been innovating. They don't have the productivity. They don't have the efficiency. And you see that play out when you look at global GDP, that the U.S. percentage of global GDP and the role of the US dollar as reserve currency has largely been stable over the last 30 years. China has been rising and became the second largest global economy. Its technological capabilities are near parity with the US, ahead in some areas. But America's allies, Europe, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Canada, they've all been declining. So with that as the backdrop, that's where we've been heading. The United States, looking at allies that are weaker, saying, number one, why are we doing all this stuff for them? Number two, we're in a position to demand lots of changes that they can't say no to. And number three, a lot of Americans don't feel like they've benefited from US leadership, even if the United States collectively, as an economy, as a military industrial complex, as a stock market, and certainly the shareholders and the owners of those companies have done very well, but the average Americans have not. And this is not just an economic inequality point. It's also an identity and immigration point. It's a lack of control of borders point. And it's a military point. Think about the fact that Donald Trump did not serve in Vietnam. And the reason he didn't serve is because he came from a wealthy family that had the ability to get him, an out so he wouldn't get drafted. Had a doctor's note, had bone spurs, right? Didn't have to serve. My dad had to serve, right? Well, there are a lot of Americans that had to serve. And they had to serve in wars like Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq, failed wars that cost trillions of dollars, but it wasn't the wealthy kids, it wasn't the powerful kids. It was a lot of young men who today are Trump voters. And Trump is saying, I'm going to end those wars. I'm not going to fight in those wars anymore. Well, so not only is the United States saying we don't want the responsibility for collective security. Ukraine, that's your problem, Europe. We're not going to do it. So that's one direct answer to your question. But there's similar answers to your question about the Americans supporting the promotion of democracy around the world. Trump's view is, don't really care if you're a democracy or not. As long as you cut a deal with me that I want, I'll work with you. So whether you're Canada or whether you're China, get the deal done, great. Don't get the deal done, there's going to be hell to pay. I was recently in Beijing. The Chinese were complaining about a lot of what Trump was saying about them. I'm like, hey, when's the last time an American president treated you as well as they treated the Canadians? Huh? And that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Free trade. Trump is not committed to free trade agreements. Trump is committed to new trade agreements, do what he wants, invest more in the United States, bring manufacturing back, make commitments to a U.S. with industrial policy, which isn't going to promote free trade anymore. And of course, foreign aid, ripping that up, no more USAID. So, I mean, in all of these areas where the U.S. had historically defined its leadership role through these big principles that the allies got on board with and the adversaries were meant to get on board with over time or else, Trump and a lot of Americans, and not just Republicans, are saying, don't want to do that anymore. And again, that not only is that a choice, but that is a choice that's been being made increasingly for a couple of decades now in the US. So it's not just a one election cycle issue. And I mean, when Obama said, actually, Europe, we're not doing Libya, even though we voted for it in the Security Council, your problem, that was a part of this. When Hillary Clinton said, I'm not doing Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though we talked about it if I win for president, that's a part of this too. And of course, Trump is an accelerant, he's a symptom, he's a beneficiary, but he's not the cause of the American choice to not take on this leadership role.
And you called that unreliability on the global stage. The Iran deal that we saw Obama get into, that President Trump pulled out of, climate agreements that Obama and Biden agreed to, that President Trump backpedaled on, like you said about Hillary Clinton. I mean, and you talk about how unreliability has become the central driver of geopolitical uncertainty and instability in today's G0 world. I mean, what do you think this America attitude of saying, not our problem anymore, the allies are weaker, we want to put America first? I mean, what do you think that's doing to us, and what do you think that's doing to our allies?
So in the near term, because the United States is in a visibly much more powerful position than any of America's allies, they are almost all, not all, but almost all, trying hard to get to yes with the Americans, with the unreliable Americans. Find a way to make Trump happy. Japan, you just saw this with the new Prime Minister Takaichi. She could not contain herself with how effervescent she was in support of everything Trump had to say, including $550 billion of Japanese investments decided by Trump into the United States. That's quite a win for Trump. And we're seeing equivalent types of engagement from a lot of countries around the world, from South Korea, from Mexico, from the UK, from the EU, and on and on and on. China, interestingly, as the one country, not an ally, an adversary, but the one country that is strong enough and has the credibility to say no to Trump, they have made Trump much more reliable. Xi Jinping just sat down with Trump for 90 minutes and got Trump to say, okay, for the next year, we're not going to do those additional tariffs. We're not going to do that 50% rule if you just are willing not to do the stuff that you threatened us with after we became unreliable. So Trump is saying, I'm willing to be reliable with you, China, because I know you've got the cards, I know you can hurt me. And we don't want that. So let's call a temporary truce and let's be reliable with each other. But with everybody else, I can be unreliable unless you give me exactly what I want. That's the difference here. And in the near term, that means a lot of American wins. The question is, what does that mean for the long term? Is unreliability of the US even more powerful? Does it lead other countries to take decisions that ultimately make them less vulnerable to American decision making? And I think the answer to that clearly is yes. Some of that is directly the response to Trump foreign policy, which is build out trade relations with other countries, create more resilience, more competitiveness, so that you don't need the Americans as much. And India is doing that, and Europe is doing that, and the rest. Some of that is the response to Trump shooting America in the foot by undermining America's attractiveness to, say, immigrants, especially non-white immigrants, because of the role of ICE and because of the going after people that are seen as politically unorthodox with the American leadership or with support for Israel, for example, on social media or their smartphones, or support for Charlie Kirk, for example, which, historically, there's never been a litmus test on that for the U.S. because the U.S. just wants the best talent, no matter what their political views. You change that, that helps other countries that don't care about that. Or going after, elite universities, which plays politically in the United States for Trump's base, but long-term will hurt America's competitiveness, will hurt investment into science, into technology, into health, all of these things that create more growth for the United States. Suddenly other countries, allies and adversaries, will be able to build their own universities at the expense of the United States, because Trump doesn't really display much interest in these longer term trends.
And to that point, then, let's say I'm Canada right now, and I'm seeing that Canada is, or China rather, which is an adversary, Canada is the ally, is being treated just as well, arguably could be even better based on what we saw with the meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping today. I mean, what are the allies thinking right now when you're seeing President Trump have these transactional relationships? Doesn't matter if you're an ally or an adversary.
Well, so under Biden, Biden talked about this idea that you've got Democrats and autocrats, and Democrats we work with and autocrats we don't, and autocrats are bad, which of course it speaks to the fact that Biden's a man of 30, 40 years ago. It doesn't reflect where the United States has ever really been, though in the Cold War there was a fair amount of it, but certainly isn't now, where there are lots of authoritarian regimes that the Americans are actually quite close to, quite aligned with. Trump's closest relationships in the world, in terms of the leaders he speaks with the most, arguably Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, which is hardly a democracy, but is a very strong and committed ally of the United States and is doing a lot to work closely with Trump. So it is, it's not as if Trump is suddenly throwing out all the allies and he has no trusted relations with anyone anymore. But what he is saying is that common values don't matter. What he's saying even more strongly is the United States doesn't even believe in the values that you thought America believed in. The United States believes in power. The United States believes in the dollar. The United States does not believe in this classical, liberal, free speech promotion of democracy that was always imperfect, always had hypocrisy, but nonetheless created the transatlantic relationship, created Japan, US, created, here are countries that can trust the United States, and they will have preferential relationships because there is alignment of common values. Trump has literally no interest in that. And so countries that think that they can get a better deal out of the US, actually the American position now is, no, you guys are taking advantage of America because you're saying we've got common values so we can get a better deal. You're free riding. And we're not going to allow that anymore. And since the Chinese are more powerful than you are, they will be able to exact a better deal than you can, even though China is an adversary, because China can hurt us. It's really a dramatic change. And the Canadians are I mean, I speak with leaders all over the world. I travel all over the world. There is a different level of awareness and willingness to grapple with this changing reality, depending on where you go. The Canadians, I would argue, are the ones that have been most fundamentally shaken, where you now see Canada saying, we can never unsee this. We will never have the relationship we used to have. People that voted for Mark Carney, people that voted for Trudeau, people that voted for Pierre Poilievre. So conservatives too, saying what the United States now stands for, this is just broken our trust for them. And this is a country that relies massively on the American market and trade, but you don't see the same tourism to the United States, and you see a desperate, what can we do to reduce the level of extraordinary exposure that we have to the US market, even as we're incredibly vulnerable to what the Americans will say and do to us. So because there was so much trust, there was so much integration, and they've been so shaken by it. This is what happens when you had all of these hockey matches and Canadians booing the national anthem, right? It was quite extraordinary. This was back when Trump was talking about Canada as the 51st state, which thankfully he has stopped doing because it was mostly about trolling Trudeau. But the lack of trust has persisted.
And to that point, something that shocked me, a few months ago, I had a Canadian guest on, and she told me just how deeply personal Canadians are taking the actions of the United States to Canada, even the 51st state comment. I mean, it was personal in a way that I think Americans brush off President Trump's comments sometimes. They were certainly not brushing that off. But I want to get back to the meeting between...
Wait, 1 second. When you say that Americans brush off, you are talking about Americans that have either voted for Trump or are largely indifferent to Trump. Let's keep in mind that in a recent poll, 1% of Democrats, identified Democrats, think the U.S. is heading in the wrong direction, and their level of antipathy for Trump, their belief that Trump is a fascist or worse, willingness to even consider or condone political violence against Trump and people that support him. This is very dangerous. And I would argue that many Democrats actually take things that Trump say far too seriously. So the problem in the U.S. is how incredibly divided the country has become, and not the idea that all Americans just don't think that what Trump says matters.
To that point, I mean, I want to talk about something that you said then. Let's switch gears here then. You talked that there was a political revolution underway in the United States, and I think that this is a good transition to that. You said you wouldn't use the term political revolution lightly. I mean, where do you think we are right now? Because to your point, when I said Americans brush that off, do all Americans? No, but some Americans think rather that President Trump, what he says sometimes, he says so much that one thing could stick, one thing could not. We keep it moving. Other people take that very seriously. I mean, where do you think we are in this political revolution?
Look, I mean, Trump just met with Xi Jinping for 90 minutes, and it was a truce. It wasn't a breakthrough, and he described that meeting as a 12. It only goes to 10. So, yes, Trump occasionally a little bit exaggerates. He can play fast and loose with the facts. I think we all know that about Trump. And yet, Trump has also engaged in an extraordinary number of unprecedented actions in the United States meant to unwind, destroy the administrative state as an independent bureaucracy that is separate from the president, unaccountable to the president, make it loyal to the president, and an arm of the government that can be weaponized against the president's political adversaries. The level of loyalty that he has and he exacts and extracts from his supporters and from the Republican Party leadership is also unprecedented. Now, when I say political revolution, here's what I mean. In my lifetime, there have been 3 political revolutions that have had global impact. The first was Deng Xiaoping's economic revolution in China that was successful and that heralded 50 years of unprecedented, almost 10% per year annual growth in China and made China into a middle-income country of 1.4 billion people. Never seen that before. Second political revolution was Gorbachev's political and economic revolution meant to transform the Soviet Union. It failed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russia and 15 independent states emerged from its corpse. The third political revolution is what is underway right now by President Trump. And we don't know if it is going to be successful or not. What we do know is that Trump believes, and his supporters believe, that the principal adversary to the United States is internal. It's domestic. He says it all the time. It's not China. It's not Russia. It's not, North Korea. It's actually the political opposition in the U.S. to him. The political opposition that he believes, with some justification, was responsible for weaponizing language against him that led to violence and even 2 assassination attempts, almost killed him, and killed Charlie Kirk, that led to the deplatforming of a sitting president from all of the social media sites and the Apple Store and everything else, that led to impeachments, no convictions, but felony convictions in New York and his mugshot. That weaponization, which he absolutely wants to not only defeat, but he wants to ensure that it can never come back again. And so that means using the FBI and the IRS and the Defense Department and the FCC and other parts of the US administration to ensure that the executive has control, that it operates above the rule of law, that the president can never do anything illegal, and that he can ensure that those people aren't just punished for their acts, but that that party cannot come back into power. And that is a political revolution. Now, we don't know how successful it will be. We don't know how much resistance there will be. But it is certainly true that the trajectory is not sustainable for representative democracy. And the United States economy, the most powerful economy in the world, with record levels in the Dow today, also has a uniquely divided, dysfunctional, and illegitimate political system compared to every other advanced industrial democracy. And the fact that you have the strongest economy and the most divided and weakest political system at the same time among the G7 is the biggest component of the risk environment that we see today.
And so then where do we go from there? You said in your speech that you think a constitutional crisis is likely before the next election. I mean, I'm thinking about the midterms in a year. There's a presidential election in 2028. What does that future look like? What does the country look like then for the midterms and then in 2028?
Well, let me say, first of all, what it doesn't look like. I don't think it's civil war, and I don't think Trump is running for a third term. It's not civil war in part because there's still a lot of control in a federal U.S. system in the states. The governors, the mayors are very legitimate. Some are red, some are blue. A lot of them are very technocratic. They are elected legitimately. And those states and cities are still going to be red and blue in 2 years and 4 years' time. Trump has himself, he likes to play with 2028, but he said very recently on Air Force One, Constitution stops me from being able to actually do it. He said, it's written, I can't really do it. I'd love to do it, I can't do it. And the Supreme Court would rule against it. And I don't think he wants that kind of a direct fight. So let's just take those extreme options off the table. But using the Department of Justice to directly go after Comey and Letitia James and many others that are part of the Democratic firmament, and saying that these people are engaged in essentially treason against the United States for having weaponized their power against me, and expanding that so that the Democratic Party starts losing its ability to run a competitive election, using the IRS to go after Soros and his Open Society Foundation, the biggest funders of the Democrats, and MacArthur and other Ford Foundation, other such major funders, and freezing the idea that you would potentially fund a national candidate against Trump because it could be used against you, going after the law firms so that the big law firms will spend a lot of money in pro bono to allow Trump and his allies to defend themselves, but would be scared of defending political opposition because then their own jobs and their law firms are going to be targeted, so that you don't get the same rule of law and the same judicial independence if you represent the political opposition than you do if you're in favor of Trump. I mean, all of those things make it much harder to have a free and fair election. So people would still be able to vote, but the incumbent party would have a much bigger structural advantage. So it's kind of much more like what you see with Viktor Orban in Hungary or with Recep Erdogan in Turkey, where so much of the political firmament is weaponized structurally in favor of those that are in power. And that doesn't mean you can't have the opposition winning, but it wouldn't be 50-50. It could be 70-30 or 80-20. And if the opposition takes over, then suddenly they have that power and they can use it. And so suddenly it's not like just you lose the election, you go to jail, right? And your family is in trouble, and your friends get investigated, and kind of like we see in some Latin American societies, for example, much more like Peru, for example, than it would be like the United States historically. So I think that is what we're looking at. And then so that would undermine the ability to have a 50-50 election, a free and fair election. Then there's the freedom issue, which is, well, what happens if you start sending the National Guard and American troops into different blue cities as a national emergency and declare martial law? And what happens if that occurs during the election and suddenly a whole bunch of people feel like, even if they're legitimate citizens and can vote, feel like I could get rounded up, this could be violent if I show up, especially if I'm brown, especially if I have, sort of some politically unorthodox views and they show up on my smartphone. I might not want to do that, right? So that could create a less free election. So I think that as that occurs, and again, we're only 9-10 months into the presidency right now, this is a 4-year presidency. I think that assuming that you just have all of this continuing to occur straight shot, and then we have elections, and then like whoever wins, that doesn't feel like the trajectory we're on. It feels much more likely that some big things come to a head before that. We just had 7 million people on the streets, thankfully very nonviolent, in the No Kings rally. Those were the biggest demonstrations in the US since Vietnam, since 1969. And it feels like that's just getting started. So again, I think that it would be a dereliction for me to just talk about an assumption that, well, the level we're at right now, no more unprecedented stuff is going to happen. We should just look out to 2026, 2028 and think about those elections.
And you made this point earlier that Republicans who are in Congress, who are in Senate, large majority of them, they back President Trump, are in full lockstep with him. Republicans who have questioned his decisions, some of his policies, they've seen themselves get primaried and they've seen themselves no longer serving in Congress or Senate. I mean, do you think then in this moment that Democrats should be, or how would you rate their leadership right now? I mean, what do you think that party should be doing?
So Republicans clearly are not going to be out of step on important issues with Trump, no matter what it is. They understand if you're in the administration, don't you dare say things that he doesn't like. If you're in Senate or the House, you are in real trouble, unless you're like McConnell, who's already done. It's his last term, but generally speaking, you're going to be outed. And CEOs understand that they don't want to say anything publicly. They'll all talk to you privately. I was having this conversation with Andrew Ross Sorkin just yesterday. He wrote that big book, 1929. He said the thing that surprises him is that no CEOs will say anything publicly. They're very unhappy about tariffs. They're very unhappy about like visas, but they won't go out publicly against Trump because they think they're going to have their head chopped off. And of course, they don't speak collectively because they don't really have an organizing principle to make that occur. So Trump, again, gets away with it. The Democrats would be willing to speak collectively, but they don't know what they stand for. I mean, there's obviously a huge fight inside the Democratic Party. You got Kamala Harris with her new book coming out that seems to think she might have a path for a run. I think that's insanity. I think she's destroyed her brand in the past months and with her failed election. I think that, you got Barack Obama and, Nancy Pelosi and everyone talking about the fight they had, about what happened when Biden finally was forced out of the election way later than it should have been. You've got Zoran Mamdani that's about to be elected very clearly in my city in New York as mayor, who calls himself a democratic socialist, radically different than the Democrats that are running for governor in New Jersey or Virginia that are much more centrist in orientation, Gavin Newsom in California, and they just stand for very, very different things. And so I think it's going to require a level of coherence for the Democrats to say what they stand for. Now, they can stand against Trump and still possibly do well if there is a free and fair election for midterms, because the midterms generally have fewer voters and are more about the incumbent. But for 2028, they can't win unless they're standing for something. And right now, the Democrats don't know what they stand for. So we're quite far from a competitive Democratic candidate on a national stage.
I mean, there's certainly a lot to look out for midterms, and beyond. But I do before I let you go, I just want to ask you about the news of the day, the meeting between, as you said, President Trump called it a 12 out of 10 meeting between Xi and Trump. President Trump said it was amazing. The big headline is that it seemed to de-escalate trade tensions. What did you make of this meeting?
It did. It temporarily de-escalated trade tensions. It's a 7 out of 10, which is, roughly my equivalent of a Trump 12. I mean, you take 5 off of it, you probably get to accuracy. They did step back from some of the fentanyl tariffs. They stepped back from the 100% that Trump announced recently. They stepped back from the 50% rule on Chinese ownership of companies that fell afoul of U.S. The watch list, the sanctions list. The Chinese did a 12-month step back from the 6 different rules on critical minerals and rare earths that they did. So it brought us back more or less to where we were on Liberation Day. While both countries are moving as fast as possible to reduce their vulnerability to the other. They're trying to decouple. The Chinese investing massively into their semiconductors, their supply chain, their domestic resilience and capacity and demand. The Americans investing massively with allies into rare earths, critical minerals, supply chain reprocessing, exploitation, all of that. This is not a breakthrough. This is not a peace deal. This is a truce. It's a temporary truce between two countries that do not trust each other at all, but recognize that the time is not right for a major blow-up. And the markets appreciate that, but we should not overstate what it represents.
Like I said, there's certainly a lot to look out for, both domestically and America on the international stage. And I'm grateful for your assessment today and breaking it down for us. Ian Bremmer, thank you so much. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Great to see you again.